The screaming has finally stopped after months of constant death rattles, agonized cries, and funeral bells that never ceased ringing. Silence has fallen over your village like a heavy blanket. But this silence is more terrifying than any scream, because it means you're alone. You're one of the few who lived through the Black Death. And now you must learn to survive in a world where the rules of civilization no longer apply. You step outside your cottage for the first time in weeks, and the sight that greets you defies comprehension. The village that once bustled with 300 souls now feels like a monument to the dead. Of the 60 houses that line these familiar streets, perhaps 15 still show signs of life. Thin wisps of smoke rising from chimneys, the occasional movement behind shuttered windows. The rest stand as tombs, doors hang open, revealing glimpses of horror within. Bodies lie where they fell, some alone, others piled together in the final desperate embraces of families who died as they had lived together. The sweet, cloying smell of decay permeates everything, so thick you can taste it on your tongue even through the cloth you've wrapped around your face. Is the summer of 1349, and you are one of perhaps 30 survivors in what was once the thriving village of Ashford in Kent. The Great Mortality, what future generations will call the Black Death, has swept through Europe, like the wrath of God himself, claiming between 1/3 and 1/2 of every community it touched. In your village, the toll was even higher. Of every 5 people you knew a year ago, 4 are now dead. You are not unique in your survival across Europe. Millions of others are emerging from hiding places, from sick beds where they somehow fought off the fever, from refuges where they waited out the storm of death. But each survivor faces the same impossible question. How do you rebuild a world when most of the people who knew how to run it are gone? The immediate challenges are overwhelming. Bodies must be buried before disease spreads further. But there are so few living to do the work of burying the dead. Food must be found. But the fields lie unharvested, and the granaries are either empty or controlled by the few remaining merchants who charge whatever prices they wish. Livestock wander freely through the village, their owners dead, creating both opportunity and chaos. More fundamentally, the entire social structure that governed medieval life has collapsed. The lord of your manor died in the 3rd week of the plague, along with his steward, his bailiff, and most of his household. The priest perished trying to give last rites to his dying parishioners. The reeve who organized communal farming is gone, along with most of the skilled craftsmen who maintain the village's economic life. You find yourself in a world where traditional authority has simply vanished. There is no one to tell you what to do, but also no one to protect you from those who might try to take what little you have. The laws that once governed property, marriage, work, and social relationships seem suddenly irrelevant when there aren't enough people left to enforce them, or even remember what they were. As you walk through the devastated village, you encounter other survivors emerging from their own hiding places. Margaret the baker's wife, whose husband and 3 children all died within a single week. Thomas the blacksmith, one of only 2 surviving craftsmen in the entire community. Old William, who at 72 has somehow outlived people a third his age. Each carries the same expression of shock and disbelief, as if they're still waiting to wake up from a nightmare that has lasted too long to be real. The conversations are halting. Careful, no one knows quite what to say to someone else who has witnessed the same horror. There's an odd mixture of guilt and relief in being alive when so many others are dead. And an unspoken question hangs in the air. Why us? Why did we survive when others, often younger, stronger, more devout, perished? But beneath the shock, you can already sense something else beginning to emerge. It's not hope exactly, not yet, but a recognition that survival requires action. The dead must be buried, the living must be fed, shelter must be maintained. Animals must be cared for, life, somehow, must go on. The first and most pressing task facing plague survivors is disposing of the dead in normal times. Burial was a community affair governed by tradition and religious protocol. Bodies were washed, dressed in their finest clothes, laid out for viewing, and interred in consecrated ground with proper ceremony. But these are not normal times. The sheer number of corpses makes traditional burial impossible in your village alone. You estimate there are more than 200 bodies that need disposal. Roughly 7 dead for every living person. Many have been decomposing for weeks. In the summer heat, making the work not just emotionally devastating, but physically dangerous. You and the other survivors quickly realize that survival trumps sentiment. Bodies must be disposed of quickly, efficiently, and with minimal ceremony. The few remaining strong men in the village, there are perhaps 8 of you, organize work parties to collect the dead. It's grim, back-breaking labor that tests both physical endurance and psychological resilience. Margaret the baker's wife proves surprisingly capable at this work. Perhaps because her experience preparing food has accustomed her to handling organic matter with clinical efficiency. They're not people anymore. She tells you matter-of-factly as you drag another body from a cottage. They're just remains. The people they were are gone. This is just cleanup. Her pragmatic approach becomes a model for other survivors. The dead are treated as a sanitation problem rather than a source of grief. Bodies are wrapped in whatever cloth is available, bedsheets, curtains, even clothing stripped from other corpses and dragged to large pits dug in what was once the village common. There's no time for individual graves, no resources for wooden coffins, and precious little energy for prayers. The work reveals the practical realities of a world with too few people. Tasks that once required many hands must now be accomplished by whoever is available, regardless of their previous social status or gender. You find yourself working alongside women who would never have performed manual labor before the plague, and they prove just as capable as men at the hard work of disposal and cleanup. Thomas the blacksmith becomes the unofficial leader of these work parties, not because he has any particular authority, but because he's one of the few with the physical strength to move the heaviest bodies. His forge has become a central gathering point, where survivors meet each morning to plan the day's work. The social hierarchies that once defined village life are being rebuilt around practical necessity, rather than traditional status. After 2 weeks of intensive work, the most pressing sanitation crisis has been addressed. The village no longer reeks of death quite so intensely, and the immediate threat of disease from decomposing bodies has been reduced. But the psychological toll of handling so many corpses is evident in every survivor's face. You've all become intimately familiar with death in ways that no living person should. The work has also revealed the true extent of the catastrophe. As you've gone house by house, you've created an informal census of survival of the village's original population. Roughly 90% are dead. The survivors are heavily skewed towards certain demographics: older adults who may have had some immunity from previous plague outbreaks, a few young adults in their prime health, and surprisingly, several very young children who somehow fought off the infection. Most of the dead were people in their 20s and 30s, the demographic that normally formed the backbone of medieval economic and social life. The implications are staggering. Your village has lost most of its skilled workers, its young parents, its leaders and decision-makers. The people who remain are either too old, too young, or too few to maintain the complex social and economic systems that previously sustained the community. With the immediate crisis of body disposal addressed, you and the other survivors must confront an equally daunting challenge: how to sustain life in a world where the normal economic systems have completely collapsed. The village that once supported 300 people with its agricultural output, craft production, and trade relationships now has fewer than 30 inhabitants. But those 30 people must somehow maintain the same infrastructure and systems. The most immediate concern is food. The spring planting was disrupted by the plague, which struck just as farmers should have been preparing fields and sowing crops. Many fields lie completely fallow, their owners dead and no one available to work them. Others were partially planted but then abandoned when the plague claimed their cultivators. Mid-season, the result is a patchwork of agricultural chaos. Some fields show promising growth where seeds were planted before the catastrophe struck. Others are overrun with weeds and wild growth. Still others have been damaged by livestock that broke free from their enclosures when their owners died and are now foraging wherever they can find food. Thomas the blacksmith takes charge of organizing agricultural recovery, not because he knows farming, but because someone needs to coordinate the work. And he's proven capable of managing group efforts. His first challenge is conducting an inventory of available resources, both human and material. The human resources are severely limited. Of the 30 survivors, perhaps 15 are physically capable of farm labor, and most of those have no experience with agricultural work. Margaret, the baker's wife, understands grain and food processing, but has never planted or harvested crops. Several survivors are children under 10 who can help with light work, but can't handle the heavy labor that farming requires. The material resources present a different kind of problem. There's actually more available than the survivors can use. With 90% of the population dead, there are vast quantities of tools, seeds, livestock, and land that belong to the deceased. But traditional property rights make it unclear who can legally claim these resources, and practical necessity conflicts with legal and moral obligations to respect the possessions of the dead. This tension comes to a head when you and several other survivors break into the manor house to search for stored grain. The building has been sealed since the Lord's death, and by traditional law, its contents belong to his heirs, who may or may not even be alive. But the village needs food. and the manor's granaries contain enough stored grain to feed the survivors through the coming winter. God helps those who help themselves, declares Margaret as she fills sacks with wheat. The dead don't need food, we do. I'd rather explain myself to the Lord's heirs than starve waiting for them to show up. Her logic is unassailable, but it represents a fundamental shift in how property rights work. Throughout medieval Europe, plague survivors are making similar calculations, taking what they need from the possessions of the dead and justifying it through necessity, rather than law. The result is a massive informal redistribution of wealth from the dead to the living. The agricultural work itself proves more challenging than anyone anticipated. Farming requires not just labor, but knowledge, understanding of seasonal cycles, soil conditions, weather patterns, and crop management that took lifetime to accumulate. Most of that knowledge died with the farmers who possessed it. You find yourself trying to learn farming through trial and error, making mistakes that would have been obvious to any experienced cultivator. Seeds are planted too early or too late, in soil that hasn't been properly prepared. Crops are harvested before they're fully mature or left too long and allowed to spoil. The learning curve is steep and costly, but necessity drives innovation. Without enough people to maintain traditional farming methods, the survivors experiment with simpler approaches that require less labor. Smaller plots are cultivated more intensively. Crops that require minimal processing are favored over those that need complex preparation. Livestock management is simplified, with animals allowed to forage more freely rather than being closely supervised. The results are mixed but encouraging. Food production is far below pre-plague levels, but it's sufficient to keep the survivors fed. More importantly, the community is learning to adapt its economic systems to match its reduced population rather than trying to maintain systems designed for a much larger community. As autumn approaches and the immediate survival challenges are gradually being addressed, you begin to notice profound changes in the social structures that once governed village life. The rigid hierarchies of medieval society, based on birth, land ownership, and traditional authority, have been shattered by the plague and are being replaced by new arrangements based on practical necessity and personal capability. The most obvious change is in gender roles. Before the plague, women's work was largely confined to domestic activities, food preparation, textile production, and child care. Men controlled agriculture, crafts, trade, and all forms of public authority. But with so many men dead and so much essential work to be done, traditional gender boundaries have become irrelevant. Margaret the baker's wife has emerged as one of the most influential people in the village, not because she has any traditional authority, but because she's proven capable of organizing complex tasks and making difficult decisions. When disputes arise over resource allocation or work assignments, people naturally turn to her for resolution. She's become a leader through competence rather than appointment. Similarly, several women have taken over tasks that were previously male domains, and Miller's daughter has learned to operate the watermill that processes grain, knowledge that died with her father and brothers. Mary Carpenter's widow has taken charge of maintaining and repairing buildings, using skills she learned by watching her husband work. Even military defense, traditionally and exclusively male responsibility, now includes women who are learning to use weapons and organize watches against bandits. The changes in class structure are equally dramatic. The traditional medieval hierarchy of nobles, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, and peasants has little meaning when most representatives of each class are dead. Social position is being redetermined based on current contribution rather than inherited status. Young Peter, who was nothing more than a farm laborer before the plague, has become one of the most important people in the village because he's one of the few with extensive agricultural knowledge. His opinions on farming matters carry more weight than those of anyone else, regardless of their previous social position. Practical expertise has become more valuable than noble birth or traditional authority. The absence of traditional authority figures has also created opportunities for previously marginalized individuals to assume leadership roles. Robert the Miller, who was considered somewhat simple-minded before the plague, has revealed unexpected organizational skills in coordinating food distribution. His methodical approach and attention to detail make him ideal for managing complex logistics that would have been handled by more formally educated administrators in the past. Religious authority has undergone particularly dramatic changes with the village priest dead and no replacement available. Spiritual leadership has fallen to whoever is capable of providing it. Old Martha, who was known for her piety and knowledge of prayers, now leads what religious services are held, but attendance is sparse, and many survivors seem to have lost faith in a God who would allow such devastation. The plague has also disrupted family structures in ways that require new social arrangements. There are several orphan children who need care, but traditional fostering arrangements assume the availability of extended family networks that no longer exist. Instead, children are being absorbed into whatever households can support them, creating new family units based on necessity rather than blood relationships. Marriage and sexual relationships are also changing, with so many potential partners. Dead, traditional courtship patterns and marriage arrangements have become impossible. Some survivors are forming partnerships based more on mutual need for companionship and shared labor than on romantic attraction or family negotiations. The shortage of potential mates has also made previously unacceptable relationships more socially acceptable. These social changes create both opportunities and tensions. People who would never have had chances to advance under the old system are discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. But the rapid transformation of familiar social structures also creates anxiety and conflict, as people struggle to understand their place in a world where traditional rules no longer apply. By winter of 1349, 8 months after the plague first struck your village, you've begun to understand that the changes wrought by the Great Mortality extend far beyond social structures and economic systems. The experience of surviving mass death and social collapse has fundamentally altered how you and other survivors think about life, death, morality, and human nature. The most obvious psychological change is in your relationship with death itself. Before the plague, death was a relatively rare and heavily ritualized event. Most people witnessed few deaths in their lifetimes, and each was surrounded by ceremony, mourning, and religious meaning. Now, you and every other survivor have seen more death in 8 months than most people in previous generations saw in entire lifetimes. This constant exposure to mortality has created a kind of psychological numbing that affects how you approach daily life. Tasks that would once have seemed important now feel trivial in comparison to the basic fact of survival. Long-term planning becomes difficult when you've seen how quickly and arbitrarily death can destroy any human ambition. The future feels uncertain in ways that make it hard to invest emotional energy in projects that extend beyond immediate needs. At the same time, there's an intense appreciation for simple pleasures that would have been taken for granted. Before the plague, a warm meal, a safe night's sleep, the companionship of another living person, these basic experiences now carry emotional weight that they never had when life seemed secure and predictable. You find yourself grateful for things that would once have been so ordinary as to be invisible. The experience has also altered your understanding of human nature and social bonds. Watching how people responded to the plague, some with heroism, others with cowardice, some with compassion, others with selfish desperation, has stripped away many illusions about human virtue and social solidarity. You've seen people abandon family members to save themselves, and you've seen strangers risk their lives to help people they barely knew. Religious faith has been profoundly affected by the plague experience. The traditional medieval worldview assumed that God rewarded virtue and punished sin, that prayer and devotion provided protection against earthly dangers, and that suffering served a divine purpose that human beings could understand and accept. But the plague seemed to strike without regard for moral character, claiming the devout and the sinful with equal indifference. Many survivors have lost faith entirely, concluding that either God doesn't exist or doesn't care about human suffering. Others have developed a darker, more fatalistic religiosity that emphasizes divine wrath and human helplessness. A few have found their faith strengthened by the experience, interpreting their survival as evidence of divine protection, but they are a minority. The psychological impact is evident in changed patterns of behavior throughout the survivor community. People are simultaneously more reckless and more cautious than they were before the plague. More reckless because the experience of mass death has made clear how little control anyone has over their fate. More cautious because the fragility of life and social order has become impossible to ignore. This combination creates interesting contradictions in daily life. Survivors take risks with property and traditional authority that would have been unthinkable before the plague, freely appropriating resources that belong to the dead and ignoring legal restrictions that no longer seem relevant. But they're also more careful about personal safety, more suspicious of strangers, and more concerned about potential threats to their security. The trauma of the plague experience has also affected memory and perception in ways that influence daily life. Many survivors report vivid dreams about the dead, sometimes comforting dreams of reunion, sometimes terrifying nightmares of being chased or attacked by plague victims. The boundary between the living and the dead feels more permeable than it did before. When death seemed like a clear and final separation, there's also a changed relationship with time and planning. The plague compressed months of normal historical development into a few weeks of catastrophic change, making it difficult to trust that current conditions will persist long enough to justify long-term investment. People focus more on immediate needs and short-term goals, because experience has taught them that long-term plans are likely to be disrupted by unpredictable catastrophes as the second winter after the plague approaches. The paradoxes of post-plague economics become increasingly apparent in some ways. The survivors face unprecedented scarcity. There simply aren't enough people to maintain all the complex economic activities that previously sustained the community. But in other ways, there's remarkable abundance, because the possessions and resources of the dead are available to the living. This combination creates economic conditions unlike anything experienced in normal times. Labor is extremely scarce and therefore valuable, but material resources are relatively abundant. The result is a dramatic shift in the relative value of different types of goods and services that transforms how economic activity is organized. Before the plague, agricultural labor was abundant and cheap. Peasants competed for opportunities to work land owned by others, and wages were kept low by the availability of desperate workers. Now, with so few people available to work the land, surviving laborers can demand unprecedented compensation and working conditions. The traditional relationship between landowners and workers has been reversed. This shift in labor economics becomes apparent when a surviving member of the gentry, Sir Geoffrey, who inherited a manor in the next village when his older brothers died, attempts to organize agricultural work using traditional methods. He offers the customary wages and working conditions that would have attracted eager workers before the plague, but he finds no takers among the survivors. "Why should I work your land for a few pennies a day?" Thomas the blacksmith asks him, "when I can work abandoned land for myself and keep all the profits? There's more good farmland sitting empty than all of us together can cultivate." Sir Geoffrey's predicament illustrates a fundamental change in power relationships. Traditional authority derived from control over scarce resources, primarily land, that were essential for survival. But when population is scarce and land is abundant, that source of power is dramatically weakened. Landowners need workers more than workers need landowners. The result is a renegotiation of economic relationships that would have been impossible. Under normal circumstances, workers demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more autonomy in how they organize their labor. Some reject wage labor entirely, preferring to cultivate abandoned land as independent farmers rather than working for others. This transformation extends beyond agriculture to all forms of economic activity. Craft production, which once required years of apprenticeship and guild membership, becomes accessible to anyone willing to learn basic skills. With so many established craftsmen dead, there's little competition and enormous demand for basic goods and services. Margaret the baker's wife, for example, has expanded far beyond bread production to include brewing, textile work, and even basic medical care, services that would have been controlled by separate guilds under normal circumstances. The lack of institutional oversight allows for economic innovation and diversification. That would have been impossible when traditional authorities were alive to enforce jurisdictional boundaries. The abundance of material resources creates additional economic opportunities. Houses, tools, livestock, and other possessions of the dead are available to survivors who can make use of them. But this abundance also creates new problems related to storage, maintenance, and allocation of resources that exceed immediate needs. Some survivors become essentially wealthy overnight through inheritance or appropriation of resources that belong to multiple deceased families but wealth in a depopulated world presents different challenges than wealth in a fully populated one. Having more resources than you can personally use is meaningless if there aren't enough other people to trade with or provide services in exchange for payment. This leads to the development of new forms of economic cooperation that blend individual ownership with communal resource sharing. Survivors pool certain types of resources, particularly tools and equipment, that are used intermittently while maintaining individual control over others. The result is a mixed economy that combines private property with collective resource management in ways that maximize efficiency given the constraints of a small population. One of the most profound challenges facing plague survivors is the massive loss of accumulated knowledge and skills that died with the victims. Medieval society depended on oral transmission of practical knowledge from masters to apprentices, from parents to children, from experienced practitioners to newcomers. When so many people died so quickly, entire categories of knowledge vanished overnight. This knowledge loss affects every aspect of daily life. You discover it when attempting to repair a roof, and realizing that no one in the village remembers the specific techniques that carpenters use to ensure watertight construction. Margaret encounters it when trying to recreate a type of bread that was popular before the plague, but whose recipe died with the baker who created it. Thomas faces it when attempting to forge specialized tools, but lacking the detailed knowledge of metallurgy that his master possessed. The problem extends far beyond practical skills to include administrative knowledge, legal precedents, trade relationships, and cultural traditions that sustain medieval community life. The village's legal records were maintained by a clerk, who died early in the plague, and no one remaining can interpret the Latin documents that recorded property boundaries, debt relationships, and customary obligations. Similarly, the complex web of trade relationships that connected your village to markets in nearby towns was managed by merchants and middlemen who are now dead. The survivors know that certain goods were regularly imported and exported, but they lack the specific knowledge of prices, routes, and contacts that made those trade relationships function. Religious knowledge presents particular challenges. The village priest was not only a spiritual leader, but also the keeper of the written word, one of the few people who could read and write Latin, maintain written records, and interpret religious and legal documents. His death creates a literacy crisis that affects far more than religious services. Old Martha, who has taken over religious duties, can recite prayers and hymns from memory, but she cannot read the Bible or other religious texts that would guide more complex theological questions. This limitation becomes problematic when survivors face moral dilemmas that require interpretation of religious law, or when they need to understand written documents that govern property rights or legal obligations. The survivors' response to this knowledge crisis reveals both pragmatic adaptation and creative innovation. Rather than trying to recreate exactly what existed before, they develop simplified versions of complex practices that can be maintained with available skills and knowledge. For example, the village's legal system becomes much more informal, relying on oral agreements and community consensus rather than written contracts and formal procedures. Disputes are resolved through discussion and negotiation rather than reference to legal precedents that no one remaining can interpret. Similarly, craft production shifts towards simpler techniques that can be learned quickly rather than complex methods that required years of training. Thomas the blacksmith abandons elaborate decorative metalwork in favor of basic tools and hardware that serve essential functions. The result is less sophisticated but more accessible to the limited number of people available to learn the skills. Some knowledge is preserved through deliberate efforts by survivors who recognize its importance. Margaret works with other women to document cooking techniques, food preservation methods, and herbal remedies in a simple written form that can be understood by people with limited literacy. Thomas begins training several younger survivors in basic metalworking, recognizing that his skills are valuable to the community. To remain concentrated in a single person, but much knowledge is inevitably lost forever. Complex craft techniques, sophisticated agricultural methods, elaborate cultural traditions, and specialized professional skills disappear because there aren't enough people with the time and ability to maintain them. The result is a simplification of culture and technology that will have lasting effects on how the post-plague world develops. This knowledge loss also creates opportunities for innovation and experimentation. Without established masters to enforce traditional methods, survivors are free to develop new approaches that might be more efficient or better suited to their changed circumstances. Some of these innovations prove superior to traditional methods, contributing to long-term improvements in technology and social organization. The Black Death's impact on religious belief and practice represents one of the most profound changes in medieval society. For centuries, Christianity had provided not just spiritual guidance, but also the fundamental framework for understanding human existence, natural phenomena, and social relationships. The plague challenged this framework in ways that forced survivors to reconstruct their understanding of divine purpose and human destiny. The most obvious religious crisis was theological. Medieval Christianity taught that God was benevolent, just, and actively involved in human affairs. Virtue was supposed to be rewarded and sin punished, both in this life and the next. Prayer, devotion, and good works were believed to provide protection against earthly dangers and ensure salvation after death. But the plague seemed to contradict every aspect of this theology. It struck without regard for moral character, claiming devout priests alongside notorious sinners, innocent children alongside hardened criminals. Prayer and devotion provided no protection against infection. Good works and charitable behavior seemed to increase, rather than decrease one's risk of exposure, since they required contact with other people who might be carriers. The clergy, who should have provided spiritual guidance during the crisis, were among the plague's heaviest casualties. Priests died at higher rates than the general population because their religious duties required them to visit the sick, administer last rites, and conduct funeral services that exposed them repeatedly to infection. The result was not just a shortage of religious leaders, but also a crisis of confidence in the institutional church's ability to understand and respond to divine will in your village. The impact of this religious crisis is evident and changed patterns of worship and belief before the plague. Religious observance was nearly universal and highly ritualized. People attended church services regularly, observed religious holidays, and integrated Christian teachings into their daily decision-making. Now, religious participation is sporadic and marked by uncertainty rather than confidence. Old Martha's attempts to maintain religious services are attended by perhaps half the survivors, and even those who participate seem to be going through familiar motions, rather than expressing genuine faith. The prayers and hymns that once provided comfort now seem to ring hollow in the context of so much unexplained suffering. More significantly, the theological questions raised by the plague remain unresolved. Why did God allow such devastation? What purpose could such suffering serve in a divine plan? How should survivors understand their own survival as evidence of divine favor, random chance, or something else entirely? Different survivors have developed different responses to these questions, creating a diversity of religious belief that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Some have abandoned Christian faith entirely, concluding that the plague proves either that God doesn't exist or that he's indifferent to human welfare. These survivors approach life with a materialistic philosophy that focuses on immediate needs and pleasures rather than eternal salvation. Others have developed a darker, more fatalistic form of Christianity that emphasizes human sinfulness and divine wrath. They interpret the plague as punishment for humanity's collective sins and expect further catastrophes as evidence of approaching divine judgment. This apocalyptic Christianity creates a sense of urgency about repentance and spiritual preparation, but offers little hope for earthly improvement. A smaller group has found their faith strengthened by the plague experience, interpreting their survival as evidence of divine protection and viewing their continued existence as a call to special service. These survivors believe they've been spared for a purpose and feel obligated to live lives of exceptional virtue and devotion. The absence of formal religious authority allows for theological experimentation that would have been suppressed under normal circumstances. Some survivors incorporate pre-Christian folk beliefs and practices into their religious observance, viewing the plague as evidence that traditional Christianity was incomplete rather than false. This religious diversity creates both opportunities and tensions within the survivor community. The shared trauma of the plague experience provides common ground that bridges some theological differences, but disagreements about divine purpose and proper religious response can create serious conflicts about community priorities and individual behavior. The long-term implications of this religious transformation extend far beyond the immediate survivor community. The questions raised by the plague about divine justice, human suffering, and religious authority will influence European Christianity for centuries to come. The diversity of religious response among survivors contributes to the development of new forms of Christian thought and practice that emphasize individual spiritual experience over institutional authority. As the second anniversary of the plague approaches, the relationships between survivors have evolved into something unprecedented in medieval society. Communities bound together by shared trauma rather than traditional kinship, feudal obligation, or geographic proximity. These new social bonds create both opportunities for mutual support and challenges related to conflicting loyalties and expectations. The most obvious change is in how people define family and kinship. Traditional medieval families were extended networks that included grandparents, parents, children, siblings, cousins, and in-laws across multiple generations. These kinship networks provided economic cooperation, social support, and political alliance that were essential for survival in a hierarchical society. But the plague destroyed most of these traditional family networks. Very few survivors have more than one or two blood relatives still living, and many have none at all. The result is the creation of new family-like relationships based on mutual dependence and shared experience rather than biological connection. You find yourself part of an informal household that includes Margaret the baker's wife, Thomas the blacksmith, two orphaned children, and an elderly woman whose own family died early in the plague. This arrangement began as a practical response to shared housing needs, but it has evolved into something resembling a family unit with its own internal dynamics and emotional bonds. The relationships within this constructed family are both similar to and different from traditional kinship bonds. There is the same sense of mutual obligation and shared responsibility that characterizes blood families, but there's also more negotiation and less assumption about roles and expectations. People must explicitly discuss and agree upon arrangements that would have been automatically understood in traditional family structures. This flexibility allows for more egalitarian relationships than were possible under traditional patriarchal family structures. Margaret's role as household organizer is based on her demonstrated competence rather than her gender or marital status. Thomas's authority in certain matters derives from his skills and experience, rather than his position as male head of household. The children are treated more as contributing members of the group rather than dependents who must obey without question. But these new family arrangements also create insecurities and conflicts that traditional kinship bonds didn't face. Blood relationships, however imperfect, provided permanent connections that couldn't be easily dissolved. Constructed families based on mutual convenience or affection are more fragile and require constant negotiation to maintain. The broader community has also developed new forms of social organization that reflect changed demographics and alter power relationships. Traditional medieval communities were governed by complex hierarchies that included feudal lords, religious authorities, merchant guilds, and various forms of customary law. Most of these institutional authorities died with their representatives during the plague. The survivor community has replaced these formal institutions with more informal, but often more democratic decision-making processes. When disputes arise or community decisions must be made, the resolution comes through discussion and consensus building rather than appeal to traditional authority. This process is evident in how the community handles resource allocation, work organization, and conflict resolution, rather than following predetermined rules about who has authority over what. Decisions are made through meetings where all adult survivors can participate and express their opinions. The result is more inclusive, but also more time-consuming and sometimes more contentious than traditional authority structures. The new social arrangements also create opportunities for individuals who would never have had leadership roles under traditional systems. Women participate in community decision-making as equals rather than as dependents of male relatives. Young adults take on responsibilities that would normally have been reserved for their elders. People from lower social classes contribute to decisions that would previously have been made exclusively by their social superiors. But these changes also create tensions with survivors who prefer traditional social arrangements, or who benefited from the old hierarchical systems. The few remaining representatives of the pre-plague elite, like Sir Geoffrey from the neighboring manor, resent the loss of their traditional authority, and occasionally attempt to reassert old forms of social control. These tensions come to a head when Sir Geoffrey tries to collect traditional feudal obligations from survivors who are working land that technically belongs to his manor. The survivors refuse, arguing that their labor is too valuable to the community to be diverted to supporting someone who contributes nothing to their survival. The old world is dead, Thomas tells Sir Geoffrey bluntly. The rules that governed it died with the people who enforced them. We're creating new rules based on what works for the living. Sir Geoffrey's inability to enforce his traditional claims illustrates the broader transformation of social relationships. Authority now derives from current contribution and community consent rather than inherited position or traditional privilege. The result is a more flexible but also more uncertain social order that must be constantly negotiated and maintained through ongoing consensus. Living through the plague and its aftermath has fundamentally altered how you and other survivors understand human nature, social relationships, and the meaning of existence. The experience of witnessing mass death and social collapse, followed by the necessity of rebuilding life from almost nothing, has created psychological changes that affect every aspect of daily life. One of the most significant changes is in how you perceive risk and safety. Before the plague, life felt relatively predictable and secure despite its hardships. There were established patterns of work, social interaction, and seasonal activity that provided a sense of continuity and control over one's destiny. Disasters happened, but they seemed exceptional rather than normal. The plague shattered this sense of predictability. It demonstrated that catastrophic change could happen suddenly, without warning, and without regard for human plans or preparations. This recognition has created a persistent anxiety about the future that affects how you approach everything from daily routines to long-term planning. The psychological impact is evident in changed patterns of behavior throughout the survivor community. People are simultaneously more cautious and more reckless than they were before the plague. More cautious because they've learned how quickly security can disappear. More reckless because they've learned how little control anyone really has over their fate. This combination creates interesting contradictions in daily life. Survivors take extraordinary precautions against potential threats, storing extra food, maintaining multiple escape routes, constantly assessing the health and reliability of other community members. But they also engage in behaviors that would have been considered dangerously irresponsible before the plague, appropriating property without legal authorization, forming intimate relationships without formal marriage, making major life changes without consulting traditional authorities. The experience has also altered fundamental assumptions about human nature and social relationships. Before the plague, medieval society was organized around the assumption that people could be trusted to fulfill their traditional roles and obligations. Social stability depended on predictable behavior, based on established customs and hierarchical relationships, but the plague revealed that traditional social bonds were more fragile than anyone had imagined. You witness people abandon family members to save themselves, religious leaders flee their congregations, and community leaders prioritize their own survival over their public responsibilities. But you also saw people risk their lives to help strangers, share scarce resources with those in need, and maintain their principles despite enormous pressures to compromise them. This mixed experience has created a more complex and nuanced understanding of human nature, rather than assuming that people will automatically behave according to their social roles or moral principles. Survivors have learned to evaluate individuals based on their actions under pressure, rather than their stated beliefs or social positions. The psychological changes are also evident in altered relationships with material possessions and social status. Before the plague, accumulating wealth and achieving higher social position were primary life goals for most people. Success was measured by one's ability to acquire property, maintain a comfortable lifestyle, and advance within established social hierarchies. But surviving the plague has demonstrated the fragility of material security and social achievement. You've seen wealthy people die as easily as poor ones. High-status individuals lose everything overnight, and carefully accumulated possessions become worthless when there's no one left to appreciate or purchase them. This recognition has created a more philosophical approach to wealth and status that emphasizes immediate utility over long-term accumulation. Survivors value possessions for their practical usefulness rather than their symbolic significance. Social relationships are evaluated based on their contribution to current well-being, rather than their potential for future advancement. The changes extend to fundamental questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence. Medieval Christianity provided clear answers to these questions. Life was a preparation for eternity. Suffering served divine purposes, and individual salvation was the ultimate goal of human existence. But the plague challenged all of these assumptions in ways that forced survivors to develop new frameworks for understanding their place in the universe. Some survivors have embraced a more materialistic philosophy that focuses on immediate experience, rather than eternal consequences. If life can end suddenly and arbitrarily, then present happiness and satisfaction become more important than future rewards. This approach leads to greater emphasis on sensual pleasure, emotional connection, and personal fulfillment than was typical in medieval religious culture. Others have developed a more fatalistic worldview that emphasizes acceptance of circumstances beyond human control. If catastrophic events can reshape the world overnight, then individual agency and planning become less important than adaptability and resilience. This philosophy creates a kind of stoic acceptance that helps people cope with uncertainty, but can also lead to passivity in the face of problems that could potentially be solved through human effort. By the third year after the plague, the most immediate survival challenges have been addressed, and the survivor community begins to focus on longer-term questions of economic development and social reconstruction. The decisions made during this period will determine whether the post-plague world represents genuine progress beyond pre-plague conditions or simply a return to previous patterns with a smaller population. The fundamental economic question facing survivors is how to organize production and distribution in a world where traditional market relationships have been disrupted by massive population loss. Before the plague, economic activity was organized around complex networks of specialization and exchange that connected rural agricultural communities with urban centers of craft production and trade. These networks depended on population density sufficient to support specialized roles. There needed to be enough people to justify having separate individuals focus exclusively on farming, craftsmanship, trade, administration, and other economic functions, but with population reduced by 60 to 70% in most areas, the old patterns of specialization are no longer viable. The result is a shift toward more generalized economic activity, where individuals and communities must become self-sufficient in ways that weren't necessary when trade relationships were reliable. Your village, which once specialized in grain production and depended on trade for manufactured goods, now produces its own tools, textiles, and other necessities that were previously imported. This shift toward self-sufficiency creates both opportunities and challenges. On the positive side, It reduces dependence on external trade relationships that might be disrupted by future catastrophes. Communities that can meet their own basic needs are more resilient in the face of political instability, natural disasters, or economic disruption. The move toward self-sufficiency also creates opportunities for innovation and experimentation that weren't possible when production was constrained by guild regulations and traditional craft methods. Thomas the blacksmith, for example, has developed new techniques for tool making that are simpler and more efficient than traditional methods but would have been forbidden by pre-plague craft guilds. Similarly, Margaret has expanded her food production and preservation activities to include techniques borrowed from multiple traditional crafts. Her combination of baking, brewing, and preservation methods creates products that are better suited to the needs of a small community than the specialized products that different crafts would have produced under the old system. But the shift towards self-sufficiency also creates problems related to efficiency and quality. Specialized production, despite its vulnerabilities, allowed for higher levels of skill development and technological advancement than generalized production can achieve. The post-plague economy produces goods that meet basic needs but lack the sophistication and refinement that specialized craftsmanship could provide. This trade-off becomes apparent in everything from tool quality to building construction to textile production. The survivor community can produce adequate versions of necessary goods, but they lack the advanced techniques and accumulated knowledge that made pre-plague crafts superior in terms of durability, functionality, and aesthetic appeal. The challenge is compounded by the loss of institutional knowledge about advanced production techniques. Guild systems, despite their restrictive practices, had preserved accumulated knowledge about optimal methods for various forms of production. When guild members died during the plague, much of this knowledge died with them, leading survivors to redevelop techniques through trial and error. The longer-term economic question is whether the post-plague world will eventually redevelop the population density and institutional structures necessary to support advanced specialization, or whether it will stabilize at a lower level of technological and economic complexity. The answer depends partly on demographic recovery, whether population growth will eventually restore the numbers necessary for complex economic organization. But it also depends on cultural and institutional choices made by survivors about how to organize economic activity. Some communities are already experimenting with new forms of economic cooperation that attempt to combine the efficiency benefits of specialization with the resilience benefits of self-sufficiency. These experiments include arrangements where individuals maintain multiple skills, but focus primarily on one area of expertise, sharing knowledge and resources with others who have different specializations. The result is a modified form of specialization that's more flexible and less vulnerable to disruption than traditional guild-based systems. The success of these economic experiments will determine whether the post-plague recovery leads to innovations that improve upon pre-plague economic organization, or simply represents a temporary setback from which society will eventually recover. Along traditional lines, one of the most pressing questions facing plague survivors is whether population will recover to pre-plague levels, and if so, how long that recovery might take. The answer has profound implications for everything from economic organization to social structure to political development in the post-plague world. The immediate demographic situation is stark. Your village, which supported 300 people before the plague, now has fewer than 30 survivors. Similar ratios are reported from other communities throughout the region. Population losses of 80 to 90% are common, with some areas experiencing complete depopulation. The mathematics of recovery from such losses are daunting, even under optimal conditions, where every survivor lives to reproductive age and produces the maximum number of children that medieval nutrition and medical care can support. It would take several generations to restore pre-plague population levels, but optimal conditions are unlikely. Many survivors are past reproductive age or have been rendered infertile by plague-related illness. The trauma and stress of the plague experience have affected reproductive health in ways that may reduce fertility even among survivors who appear to have recovered completely. The social disruption has interfered with normal courtship and marriage patterns, potentially delaying family formation even when fertile partners are available. More fundamentally, the question remains whether survivors actually want to restore pre-plague population levels. The current demographic situation, despite its challenges, offers certain advantages that might be lost if population recovery occurs too rapidly or completely. With abundant land and resources available relative to population, survivors enjoy a standard of living that would have been impossible under pre-plague conditions. Individual families can occupy entire houses that would have been shared by multiple families before the plague. There's more food available per person, more choice in occupation and residence, and more social mobility than traditional medieval society typically allowed. Some survivors argue that maintaining a lower population density would be preferable to returning to pre-plague conditions. Why would we want to go back to the old ways? Asked Margaret during one community discussion. We have enough resources now for everyone to live comfortably. If population grows back to what it was before, we'll just return to the same poverty and competition that made life so hard. This perspective raises important questions about the relationship between population density and quality of life. Medieval society had assumed that larger populations were inherently better. More people meant more production, more defense capability, and more cultural development. But the post-plague experience suggests that population density beyond a certain level might actually reduce individual welfare and social stability. The demographic question is also complicated by immigration and emigration patterns that are still developing. Some plague survivors are leaving their original communities to seek opportunities elsewhere, attracted by reports of abandoned land or surviving communities that need additional population. Others are moving to consolidate with relatives or friends in locations that offer better resources or security. These population movements create both opportunities and challenges for individual communities. Immigration can provide needed labor and skills, but it can also strain resources and create social tensions between original survivors and newcomers. Emigration can reduce pressure on local resources, but it can also deprive communities of valuable skills and reduce the social bonds that hold survivor groups together. The longer-term demographic outlook depends partly on factors beyond the control of individual communities. Disease patterns, climate conditions, political stability, and economic opportunities will all influence how quickly population recovers and where growth occurs most rapidly. But it also depends on conscious choices made by survivors about family size, community development, and resource allocation. Communities that actively encourage population growth through immigration recruitment, family support, and economic development may recover more quickly than those that prioritize stability and resource conservation. The demographic choices made during the recovery period will have lasting effects on the social and economic development of post-plague society. Communities that achieve rapid population growth may be able to restore complex economic and social institutions more quickly, but they may also reproduce the problems of inequality and resource competition that characterize pre-plague society. Communities that maintain lower population densities may enjoy higher individual living standards and more egalitarian social relationships, but they may also remain vulnerable to external threats and unable to support advanced cultural and technological development. The resolution of this demographic question will ultimately determine whether the post-plague world represents a fundamental transformation of medieval society or simply a temporary interruption in long-term historical development patterns. As the fourth year after the plague begins, the cultural changes wrought by the Great Mortality become increasingly apparent in everything, from artistic expression to social customs to intellectual development. The shared experience of surviving mass death and social collapse has created new forms of cultural expression, while disrupting traditional patterns of cultural transmission and development. The most obvious cultural change is an artistic and literary expression. Before the plague, medieval culture was dominated by religious themes that emphasized eternal salvation, divine providence, and the temporary nature of earthly existence. Art, music, and literature typically focused on spiritual subjects that directed attention away from immediate physical experience toward transcendent religious truth. But the plague experience has generated cultural expression that's much more focused on immediate human experience, physical reality, and the fragility of life. The few surviving works of art and literature produced by plague survivors emphasize themes of mortality, loss, and the preciousness of present experience in ways that would have been considered inappropriately worldly under traditional medieval cultural standards. This shift is evident in the songs and stories that have emerged from the survivor community. Rather than traditional religious hymns or heroic tales of noble adventure, the new cultural expressions focus on ordinary human experiences of love, friendship, work, and community. They celebrate simple pleasures in everyday relationships that might have been considered too mundane for artistic treatment in pre-plague culture. The change in cultural focus reflects broader changes in social values and priorities. The plague experience has demonstrated the fragility of all human achievements and institutions, making immediate human connections and experiences seem more valuable than abstract principles or long-term goals. This cultural transformation is also evident in changing approaches to education and knowledge transmission. Before the plague, Education was primarily concerned with preserving and transmitting established knowledge from authoritative sources, religious text, classical literature, and traditional craft techniques. Innovation and experimentation were discouraged in favor of faithful reproduction of received wisdom. But the massive loss of traditional knowledge during the plague has forced survivors to approach learning differently. With so much established knowledge lost and so many traditional authorities dead, education has become more focused on problem solving, experimentation, and adaptation than on faithful reproduction of established methods. This shift is visible in how skills are being taught to children and young adults in the survivor community, rather than learning through lengthy apprenticeships that emphasize exact replication of traditional methods. Young people are encouraged to understand underlying principles that can be applied flexibly to new situations. Thomas the blacksmith, for example, teaches metalworking by explaining the properties of different metals and the effects of various heating and cooling techniques, rather than simply demonstrating specific procedures to be memorized and repeated. This approach produces craftsmen who are more capable of innovation and adaptation, but potentially less skilled at producing traditional products that require precise execution of established techniques. The cultural changes extend to social customs and behavioral norms that govern daily interaction. Traditional medieval culture emphasized hierarchy, deference, and adherence to established social roles. Proper behavior was defined by one's position in complex social hierarchies that prescribed appropriate conduct for people of different ages, genders, social classes, and occupational categories. But the plague disrupted these hierarchical relationships in ways that require new forms of social interaction, with traditional authority figures dead and social roles redistributed based on practical necessity, rather than inherited status. Survivors have developed more egalitarian customs that emphasize mutual respect and collaborative decision-making. These new social customs are evident in everything from how people address each other, to how decisions are made, to how conflicts are resolved. The formal titles and elaborate courtesy rituals that once marked social distinctions have been largely abandoned in favor of more direct and informal interaction patterns. The changes also affect gender relationships in ways that challenge traditional medieval assumptions about appropriate roles for men and women, with survival dependent on everyone contributing whatever skills they possess regardless of traditional gender boundaries. Cultural norms about masculine and feminine behavior have become more flexible. Women participate in community decision-making, perform physical labor, and take leadership roles in ways that would have been scandalous under traditional cultural standards. Men engage in domestic work, express emotional vulnerability, and defer to female expertise in areas where women have superior knowledge or skills. These cultural changes create both opportunities and tensions within the survivor community. People who adapt successfully to new cultural norms enjoy greater personal freedom and social mobility than would have been possible under traditional systems. But those who prefer familiar cultural patterns may feel disoriented and uncomfortable. In a world where established customs no longer provide clear guidance for appropriate behavior, the long-term significance of these cultural changes depends on whether they represent permanent transformations or temporary adaptations to crisis conditions. If population recovery leads to the restoration of traditional social hierarchies and economic relationships, cultural norms may eventually return to pre-plague patterns. But if the new social arrangements prove more successful or satisfying than traditional ones, the cultural changes may become permanent features of post-plague society. In the 5th year after the plague, patterns of leadership and authority that emerged during the initial crisis have solidified into new forms of social organization that represent a fundamental departure from traditional medieval governance. The absence of hereditary nobles, appointed officials, and institutional authorities has created space for leadership based on demonstrated competence and community consent, rather than inherited status or external appointment. The evolution of leadership in your survivor community illustrates these broader changes. During the first months after the plague, leadership was informal and task-specific. Whoever had relevant knowledge or skills took charge of particular activities, but there was no overall authority structure or permanent hierarchy. Thomas the blacksmith emerged as a leader in work organization because his experience with complex projects made him effective at coordinating group efforts. Margaret became influential in resource allocation because her background in food preparation gave her practical knowledge about storage, distribution, and quality assessment. Other survivors took leadership roles in specific areas based on their particular expertise and demonstrated capability. But as the immediate crisis passed and longer-term community development became necessary, the need for more permanent and comprehensive leadership structures became apparent. Decisions about land use, resource allocation, external relationships, and community development required coordination and authority that went beyond task-specific expertise. The solution that emerged represents a creative adaptation of democratic principles to medieval social conditions, rather than selecting a single leader or returning to traditional hierarchical authority. The community developed a council system where different individuals have authority over different aspects of community life. Thomas leads work organization and external defense. Margaret oversees resource management and internal disputes. Old William, whose age and experience command respect, handles relationships with other communities and negotiations with outside authorities. Several other survivors have responsibility for specific areas like animal husbandry, craft production, and education. This council system provides the coordination benefits of centralized authority, while maintaining the flexibility and inclusiveness that help the community survive the initial crisis. Decisions are made through discussion and consensus among council members, with input from other community members when issues affect them directly. The system also includes mechanisms for changing leadership based on performance, rather than permanent appointment. Council members can be replaced if they prove ineffective or if other community members develop superior skills in their areas of responsibility. This accountability creates incentives for effective leadership, while protecting against the abuse of power that can develop when authority is permanent and unquestioned. But the new leadership system also creates challenges that traditional authority structures were designed to address. Decision-making through consensus is time-consuming and sometimes results in compromise solutions that satisfy no one completely. The lack of clear hierarchy can create confusion about who has authority in emergency situations, or when quick decisions are necessary. More fundamentally, the democratic elements of the new system conflict with broader medieval social and political structures that remain hierarchical and authoritarian. When representatives of traditional authority, like Sir Geoffrey or visiting church officials, interact with the survivor community, there are often conflicts about protocol, jurisdiction, and legitimacy. These conflicts reflect broader questions about whether post-plague social innovations can coexist with surviving traditional institutions, or whether they represent fundamental challenges to medieval political and social order. The success of democratic leadership in small survivor communities doesn't necessarily mean that similar systems would work in larger or more complex social situations. The evolution of leadership also reflects changing cultural values that emphasize practical effectiveness over symbolic authority. Traditional medieval leadership was often more concerned with maintaining proper relationships and ceremonial obligations than with achieving specific practical goals. Leaders were expected to embody social ideals and cultural values, even when doing so interfered with administrative efficiency. But plague survivors have developed leadership expectations that prioritize results over ceremony. Leaders are evaluated based on their ability to solve problems, coordinate activities, and advance community welfare rather than their ability to fulfill symbolic roles or maintain traditional dignities. This pragmatic approach to leadership creates opportunities for individuals who would never have achieved authority under traditional systems. Women, young adults, and people from lower social classes can become leaders if they demonstrate relevant skills and community support. But it also means that leadership positions require constant performance and can be lost quickly if circumstances change or if other individuals prove more capable. The long-term implications of these leadership changes depend on whether they remain confined to small survivor communities or begin to influence broader patterns of political organization. If the new systems prove more effective than traditional authorities at addressing practical problems, they may gradually spread to other communities and eventually challenge established political structures. But if traditional authorities successfully reassert control as population and institutional capacity recover, the democratic innovations of the plague period may be remembered as temporary expedients, rather than permanent improvements in political organization. As the survivor community approaches the 5th anniversary of the plague, the economic relationships that have evolved during the recovery period represent perhaps the most significant departure from traditional medieval economic organization. The necessity of survival has created new forms of property ownership, labor organization, and resource distribution that challenge fundamental assumptions about how economic activity should be structured. The most obvious change is in property relationships. Traditional medieval society was organized around the principle that land ownership determined social status and economic opportunity. Most land was controlled by hereditary nobles, who granted use rights to peasants in exchange for labor obligations and agricultural payments. This system created stable but inflexible relationships that severely limited social mobility and economic innovation. But the plague disrupted these traditional property relationships in ways that have created opportunities for fundamentally different approaches to land ownership and use. With so many landlords dead and their heirs often unknown or absent, survivors have effectively become independent farmers controlling land that they work directly, rather than holding as tenants under feudal obligations. This transformation is evident in how your community has organized agricultural production. Rather than working assigned plots under the supervision of a manor lord's representatives, survivors have divided available land based on their ability to work it effectively and their contribution to community welfare. The result is a more egalitarian distribution of productive resources than would have been possible under traditional feudal arrangements. The change in property relationships has also affected other forms of economic activity. Craft production, which was traditionally controlled by guild organizations that limited membership and regulated methods, has become more open and competitive. With guild authorities dead and traditional restrictions unenforceable, anyone with relevant skills can engage in craft production and trade. Margaret's expansion into multiple forms of food production and processing illustrates this transformation. Before the plague, baking, brewing, and food preservation would have been separate crafts, controlled by different guilds with strict jurisdictional boundaries. Her ability to combine these activities represents both practical efficiency and a fundamental change in how economic specialization is organized. The new economic arrangements also include innovative approaches to labor organization that blend individual initiative with collective cooperation, rather than the traditional system where individual peasants worked assigned plots under feudal obligations. The survivor community has developed flexible work arrangements where people contribute labor based on their abilities and receive compensation based on their contributions. This system includes elements of both individual property rights and collective resource sharing. Survivors maintain individual control over their houses, personal possessions, and specific productive activities, but they also participate in collective projects that require coordinated effort and shared resources. The harvest, for example, is organized as a community effort where everyone contributes labor based on their ability and receives a share of the output based on their contribution and their household's needs. This approach is more efficient than individual farming would be with the available labor force, but it also maintains individual incentives for productive effort. Similarly, craft production includes both individual workshops where craftsmen produce goods for trade and collective projects where multiple people work together on large or complex items that require diverse skills. The result is an economic system that captures benefits of both specialization and cooperation without the rigidities of traditional guild organization. The transformation extends to trade relationships and monetary systems. Traditional medieval commerce was organized around complex networks of professional merchants who controlled trade routes and maintained relationships with producers and consumers in different regions. But many of these commercial networks were disrupted by population loss and social disruption during the plague. The survivor community has responded by developing more direct and flexible trading relationships rather than depending on professional merchants. Community members engage directly with producers and consumers in other areas, creating trading partnerships that are more personal and adaptable than traditional commercial relationships. These new trading arrangements often involve barter exchanges rather than monetary transactions, partly because coin is scarce, but also because direct exchange of goods and services creates more personal relationships between trading partners. The result is a more localized and relationship-based form of commerce that's less efficient than professional merchant networks, but also more resilient and less vulnerable to external disruption. The long-term implications of these economic changes depend on whether they represent permanent improvements in economic organization or temporary adaptations to crisis conditions. If the new systems prove more productive and satisfying than traditional arrangements, they may become models for broader economic reform. But if traditional economic institutions reassert control as population and institutional capacity recover, the innovations of the plague period may be suppressed as threats to established economic interests. As news of your community's successful recovery spreads to other areas, the question of relationships with external authorities becomes increasingly complex and potentially threatening. The social and economic innovations that have enabled survival and prosperity within the survivor community challenge traditional medieval power structures in ways that may provoke hostile responses from surviving representatives of the old order. The most immediate challenge comes from ecclesiastical authorities, who view the community's religious independence as a threat to church authority. The absence of formal religious leadership and the development of informal, community-based spiritual practices contradict fundamental principles of medieval Christianity about the necessity of ordained clergy and institutional religious authority. This conflict comes to a head when a surviving bishop from a nearby diocese visits the community to assess religious conditions and reassert church control. Bishop Edmund arrives expecting to find a community grateful for renewed religious guidance and eager to return to traditional church practices. Instead, he encounters a group of survivors who have developed their own approaches to spiritual life and who question the relevance of formal religious authority. You have allowed yourselves to drift into dangerous spiritual territory, the bishop warns. During a community meeting without proper religious guidance, you risk falling into heresy and endangering your eternal salvation. The church exists to provide the spiritual leadership that individuals cannot provide for themselves. But his arguments fall flat with survivors who have maintained their faith and moral principles without institutional support and who have seen church authorities flee or die during the plague, while ordinary believers remain to care for each other. Where was the church when we were burying our dead? Asked Margaret. Where were the bishops when we needed spiritual comfort during the worst crisis in human memory? We've learned to find God without intermediaries, and we've discovered that faith doesn't require institutional authority to be genuine. The bishop's visit ends unsuccessfully, with the community politely but firmly declining to submit to external religious authority. But it also serves as a warning that church officials view the community's independence as a threat that may require more forceful correction in the future. Similar challenges arise with secular authorities who view the community's economic and political innovations as threats to traditional feudal relationships. Sir Geoffrey's earlier attempts to reassert manorial authority were unsuccessful, but he has continued to petition higher authorities for support in reclaiming his traditional rights and obligations. The challenge becomes more serious when a royal official arrives to investigate reports of unauthorized land use, improper tax collection, and failure to fulfill feudal obligations. The official, Sir Robert de Clare, represents the kind of traditional authority that survived the plague in areas where population loss was less severe and institutional structures remained intact. You cannot simply ignore legal obligations because they've become inconvenient, Sir Robert explains during tense negotiations. The land you're working belongs to established manors, with legal rights that survive the death of individual holders. The taxes you're not paying are owed to the crown regardless of local population changes. The feudal obligations you're ignoring are fundamental to the legal order that protects everyone's rights. But the community's response reflects how much their perspective has changed. During the recovery period, rather than accepting traditional authority as legitimate, they question whether legal obligations that ignore practical reality serve any useful purpose. The legal rights you're talking about assume a world that no longer exists, Thomas responds. The people who held those rights are dead. The economic relationships that supported them have collapsed. The social structures that enforced them have disappeared. We're not ignoring legal obligations. We're creating new ones that actually serve the needs of living people. The confrontation with Sir Robert illustrates the fundamental tension between innovation born of necessity and traditional authority that claims legitimacy regardless of practical effectiveness. The survivor community has developed systems that work well for their circumstances, but those systems challenge established legal and political structures that surviving authorities are determined to preserve. The external pressure creates internal debates within the community about how to balance independence with the need for external relationships. Some survivors argue for accommodation with traditional authorities, believing that conflict with powerful external forces will ultimately threaten the community's survival and prosperity. Others argue for resistance, believing that submission to traditional authority will destroy the innovations that have made recovery possible and return the community to the inequalities and limitations of pre-plague society. These debates reflect broader questions about whether the social innovations of the plague period can coexist with surviving traditional institutions, or whether they represent fundamental challenges to medieval social and political order that will inevitably provoke hostile responses. The resolution of these external challenges will determine whether the community's innovations can survive and potentially influence broader social development, or whether they will be suppressed as temporary aberrations from proper social organization as the survivor community approaches its 6th year of existence. Questions about inheritance and property transmission become increasingly important for long-term stability and development. The traditional medieval inheritance systems that govern property transfer from one generation to the next have been disrupted by the plague in ways that require new approaches to ensuring continuity and preventing conflict. The immediate inheritance challenges are complex because traditional medieval inheritance law assumed family structures that no longer exist in many cases. Inheritance typically passed through established bloodlines according to primogeniture, with eldest sons inheriting landed property and other heirs receiving smaller portions or entering religious life. But many survivor households include people who are not related by blood, but who have formed family-like relationships based on mutual dependence and shared experience. The children in your constructed household, for example, are not the biological offspring of any adult members, but they've been raised as family members and have contributed to household welfare and prosperity. Traditional inheritance law provides no clear guidance for how property should pass to these constructed family relationships, creating potential for serious conflicts. When the original survivors die and questions of succession arise, the community has begun developing new inheritance practices that reflect their altered social relationships and values, rather than rigid adherence to bloodline succession. The emerging inheritance system emphasizes contribution to household welfare and community acceptance of family relationships regardless of biological connection. This approach is evident in how Margaret has begun planning for the eventual transfer of her expanded food production activities, rather than leaving her assets to distant blood relatives who played no role in developing the business. She's training the young people in her household and planning to leave her productive assets to those who have contributed to their development and who are capable of continuing the work. Family is about who you choose to care for and who chooses to care for you, she explains. Blood relationships that were broken by distance and death matter less than the relationships we've built through shared work and mutual support. But these innovative inheritance practices create potential conflicts with traditional legal authorities, who may not recognize non-traditional family relationships or inheritance arrangements. If external authorities successfully reassert control over the community, inheritance based on constructed family relationships, rather than blood succession, might be challenged or invalidated. The inheritance question also extends to community assets and innovations that have been developed through collective effort. The agricultural improvements, craft techniques, and social institutions that have enabled the community's success represent forms of wealth that didn't exist before the plague, and that traditional inheritance law doesn't address. Who should inherit control over community assets when the original survivors die? Should they pass to biological heirs who may have no connection to the community, or to community members who contributed to their development? Should collective assets remain under community control, or should they be divided among individual inheritors? These questions become more pressing as the community's success begins to attract immigration from other areas. New arrivals bring additional labor and skills that contribute to community prosperity, but they also complicate inheritance relationships by creating multiple claims on community assets and innovations. The community has begun developing inheritance practices that attempt to balance individual property rights with collective ownership of community innovations. Individual survivors maintain personal control over assets they brought to the community or developed through individual effort, but assets developed through collective work remain under community ownership regardless of individual inheritance claims. This system creates incentives for individual productivity while protecting community assets from being dispersed through inheritance to people with no commitment to community welfare. But it also requires complex decisions about which assets are individual and which are collective, and those decisions may become sources of serious conflict as inheritance questions become more pressing. The inheritance challenges also reflect broader questions about the community's long-term development and identity. If inheritance follows traditional patterns that favor biological relationships and external heirs, the community's innovations may be lost as control passes to people who don't share the values and experiences that created them. But if inheritance follows innovative patterns that favor community relationships and local continuity, the community may face conflicts with external authorities who view non-traditional inheritance as a threat to established legal and social order. The resolution of inheritance questions will determine whether the community's innovations can survive generational change and continue to develop, or whether they will be lost as control passes to people who prefer traditional social and economic arrangements. As the community enters its 7th year of existence, the shared experiences of survival, recovery, and innovation have begun to crystallize into new cultural traditions that reflect the unique circumstances of post-plague life. These emerging traditions serve both practical and symbolic functions, helping to preserve the lessons learned during the recovery period, while creating a distinct cultural identity for the community. The most significant new tradition is the annual remembrance gathering held on the anniversary of the plague's end. This event combines elements of memorial service, harvest celebration, and community meeting in ways that acknowledge the tragedy of the plague, while celebrating the achievements of the recovery period. The remembrance gathering begins with a Reading of names, not just of plague victims, which would be too numerous and depressing, but of specific individuals whose lives and deaths had particular significance. For the survivor community, the baker whose techniques Margaret adapted and improved, the priest whose religious leadership informed the community's spiritual development, even after his death, the children whose deaths motivated adults to work harder to create a world worth inheriting. This memorial component is followed by presentations about community achievements. During the past year, new techniques developed, problems solved, relationships strengthened. The presentations serve both to document progress and to share knowledge that might be useful for future challenges. The gathering concludes with collective planning for the coming year, including decisions about resource allocation, community projects, and external relationships. This planning process reflects the democratic decision-making traditions that emerged during the crisis period and helps ensure that community development continues to reflect collective values rather than individual preferences. The Remembrance Gathering has become the community's most important cultural event, but it's been supplemented by other traditions that mark significant moments in the annual cycle. The planning blessing ceremony combines Christian prayers with practical discussions about agricultural planning. The harvest sharing feast distributes food according to contribution and need while celebrating collective agricultural success. These new traditions differ from pre-plague cultural practices in several important ways. They emphasize practical knowledge and collective decision-making rather than religious doctrine and hierarchical authority. They celebrate human achievements and relationships rather than divine providence and individual salvation. They focus on community welfare and mutual support rather than personal virtue and eternal reward. The changes reflect the altered worldview that has emerged from the plague experience. Traditional medieval culture emphasized humanity's dependence on divine providence and the importance of accepting established authority and social hierarchy. The plague survivors have learned that human cooperation and innovation are often more reliable sources of security and prosperity than religious faith or traditional authority. The new cultural traditions also serve important practical functions related to knowledge preservation and social cohesion. The systematic sharing of information during community gatherings helps ensure that important knowledge isn't lost when individuals die or leave the community. The emphasis on collective decision-making helps maintain the democratic traditions that have proven effective for community governance. But the development of distinct cultural traditions also creates potential problems related to external relationships and cultural continuity. The community's cultural practices increasingly diverge from broader medieval Christian culture in ways that may provoke hostility from external authorities or create barriers to interaction with other communities. More fundamentally, the new traditions reflect values and assumptions that may not be suitable for different circumstances or larger populations. The emphasis on direct democracy and collective decision-making works well in a small community where everyone knows everyone else, but it might not be effective in larger or more complex social situations. The cultural innovations also raise questions about intergenerational transmission. The adults who created these traditions are motivated by shared memories of the plague experience and collective participation in recovery efforts. But children who grow up after the plague won't have those shared experiences, and they may not understand or value traditions that seem arbitrary rather than necessary. The challenge of cultural transmission is already becoming apparent as children in the community reach adolescence and begin questioning adult practices and values. Some young people are attracted to traditional religious and cultural practices that seem more sophisticated or prestigious than local innovations. Others are interested in opportunities outside the community that might require abandoning local cultural traditions. The success of the community's cultural innovations depends partly on their ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values and practices. If the new traditions become rigid and inflexible, they may become obstacles to continued development rather than supports for community welfare. But if they can evolve in response to new challenges, while maintaining their essential functions of knowledge preservation, social cohesion, and democratic decision-making, they may provide a foundation for continued innovation and prosperity that extends well beyond the original plague survivor generation. As the community approaches its 8th anniversary, success has created new challenges related to growth, expansion, and the absorption of newcomers who don't share the founding experiences that shape the community's distinctive culture and institutions. The decisions made about expansion will determine whether the community's innovations can scale up to larger populations or whether they will be diluted or lost as the community grows. The most immediate expansion challenge comes from increased immigration. Word of the community's prosperity and social innovations has spread to other areas, attracting people from communities that haven't recovered as successfully from the plague. or that have returned to traditional social arrangements that many find unsatisfying. These newcomers bring valuable skills and additional labor that could accelerate the community's development, but they also bring different expectations and values that may conflict with established practices. Many immigrants expect traditional, hierarchical relationships and are uncomfortable with the democratic decision-making processes that the original survivors developed. The tension becomes apparent when a group of skilled craftsmen arrives from a nearby town that has restored traditional guild organization. The craftsmen are attracted by economic opportunities in the community, but they expect to establish traditional master-apprentice relationships and exclusive craft jurisdictions that conflict with the community's more flexible approach to skill development and economic cooperation. We need proper organization of craft production, argues Master John, a carpenter who wants to establish formal apprenticeship programs and standardized production methods. The informal approaches you've developed may work for basic needs, but they won't support advanced craftsmanship or quality control. But established community members resist changes that might undermine the egalitarian relationships and flexible specialization that have contributed to their success. Thomas the blacksmith, whose own skills have developed through experimentation rather than formal training, sees traditional craft organization as a threat to innovation and social mobility. We've learned that people can develop skills and contribute to community welfare without formal hierarchy and exclusive jurisdictions, he responds. Why should we return to systems that limit opportunity and create artificial barriers between people who need to work together? The debate reflects broader questions about whether the community's innovations can accommodate growth without losing their essential characteristics. Democratic decision-making works well when everyone knows everyone else and shares similar experiences and values. But it becomes more difficult as the community grows and includes people with diverse backgrounds and expectations. The community has begun experimenting with modified decision-making processes that attempt to preserve democratic principles while accommodating larger numbers and greater diversity, rather than requiring consensus among all community members. Important decisions are now made by elected representatives who consult with their constituents and attempt to balance different interests and perspectives. But these modifications create new tensions between democratic participation and administrative efficiency. The representative system is faster than consensus building among all community members, but it's also less inclusive and may not reflect the preferences of people who aren't effectively represented by the elected officials. The expansion challenges also extend to physical infrastructure and resource management. The community's economic and social systems were designed for a population of 30 to 40 people, living in a compact geographic area, doubling or tripling. That population requires investments in housing, agricultural development, and craft facilities that strain available resources and require more complex coordination. The physical expansion also affects social relationships in ways that may undermine the personal connections that have sustained community cohesion. When everyone knows everyone else personally, social cooperation can be based on individual relationships and mutual trust. But as the community grows, those personal connections become less universal and must be supplemented by more formal institutions and rules. The challenge of maintaining community identity while accommodating growth is further complicated by generational change. The children who grew up in the original survivor community are now reaching adulthood and making decisions about whether to remain in the community or seek opportunities elsewhere. Some young adults are attracted to opportunities in larger towns and cities that offer more diverse economic activities, cultural experiences, and potential marriage partners. Their departure represents a loss of human capital and cultural continuity that weakens the community's ability to maintain its distinctive institutions and traditions. Others remain in the community, but bring different perspectives and priorities that reflect their experiences growing up in a recovering society, rather than surviving social collapse. They may be less committed to the egalitarian values and democratic practices that were forged through shared trauma and more interested in individual advancement and material prosperity. The resolution of expansion challenges will determine whether the community's innovations represent permanent improvements in social organization or temporary adaptations to crisis conditions. If the innovations can be successfully adapted to larger populations and changing circumstances, they may provide models for broader social development. But if they cannot scale up without losing their essential characteristics, they may remain interesting historical curiosities rather than significant contributions to social progress. 10 years after the plague, your community has achieved a level of prosperity that would have been impossible under pre-plague conditions. But success has created new challenges that test whether the social innovations developed during the crisis can survive and flourish under conditions of abundance rather than scarcity. The community now supports nearly 200 residents, including original survivors, immigrants attracted by economic opportunities, and a growing population of children born after the plague. Agricultural production exceeds local needs, generating surplus crops that are traded for manufactured goods, raw materials, and luxury items from other regions. Craft production has expanded beyond basic necessities to include high-quality tools, textiles, and other goods that command premium prices in regional markets. The community has become known throughout the area for innovative production techniques and superior products that reflect the creative problem-solving skills developed during the recovery period. But prosperity has also created social stratification that challenges the egalitarian values that emerged from the plague experience. Some community members have accumulated significantly more wealth than others through successful craft production, favorable trade relationships, or advantageous marriages. These wealth differences are beginning to translate into social and political influence that mirrors traditional medieval hierarchies. The tension becomes apparent in community decision-making processes, where wealthy residents expect their opinions to carry more weight than those of ordinary community members. Master craftsmen who employ several workers argue that their economic contributions justify greater political influence. Successful traders who generate community wealth through external commerce claim special expertise in economic decisions. Those who contribute most to community prosperity should have the greatest voice in community decisions, argues William the Merchant, who has built a successful trading operation that connects the community to markets throughout the region. Democratic equality made sense when we were all equally desperate, but now that we have different levels of contribution and expertise, we need decision-making processes that reflect those differences. But other community members resist changes that would undermine the democratic principles that they believe contributed to the community's success. Margaret, now in her 60s but still influential in community affairs, sees wealth-based political influence as a threat to the social cooperation that enabled recovery. We survived and prospered because we worked together as equals, she argues. If we allow wealth differences to create political inequalities, we'll destroy the social bonds that made our success possible. The debate reflects broader questions about whether egalitarian social relationships can survive economic success or whether prosperity inevitably creates hierarchies that undermine democratic institutions. The community's experience suggests that crisis conditions may be more conducive to social cooperation than comfortable circumstances. The prosperity challenges also extend to relationships with external authorities, who are now more interested in the community's affairs than they were when it was struggling to survive. The community's economic success has attracted attention from tax collectors, trade regulators, and feudal authorities who view its prosperity as a source of potential revenue, and its social innovations as threats to established order. The renewed external pressure forces the community to make difficult choices about accommodation versus resistance. Compliance with external demands for taxes, trade regulations, and social conformity would provide security but might undermine the innovations that created prosperity. Resistance might preserve local autonomy but could provoke hostile responses that threaten the community's survival. The community has attempted to navigate these pressures through selective compliance that preserves essential autonomy while avoiding direct confrontation with external authorities. They pay taxes but negotiate amounts based on their actual capacity, rather than traditional assessments. They comply with trade regulations but maintain innovative practices that provide competitive advantages, but this balancing act becomes increasingly difficult as the community's success becomes more visible and external authorities become more determined to assert control. The question of whether innovative communities can maintain their distinctiveness while participating in broader social and economic systems remains unresolved. The prosperity challenges also affect individual life choices in ways that test community cohesion and shared values. With wealth and opportunities available, community members must choose between personal advancement and collective welfare in situations where those goals conflict. Some successful community members use their prosperity to educate their children in distant cities, provide dowries for advantageous marriages outside the community, or invest in opportunities that benefit their families but not the broader community. These individual choices are rational responses to available opportunities, but they may weaken community bonds and drain human capital. The test of prosperity ultimately raises fundamental questions about the relationship between material success and social values. The community's innovations were developed under conditions of necessity that required cooperation and innovation for survival. Whether those innovations can survive and flourish under conditions of choice and abundance remains to be seen. As the 15th anniversary of the plague approaches, you find yourself increasingly reflective about the long journey from catastrophe to prosperity, and about the broader historical significance of the social experiment that your community represents. The passage of time has provided perspective on both the achievements and limitations of the post-plague innovations, and on their relevance for understanding human capacity for social adaptation and change. The most obvious achievement is simple survival and recovery. From the 30 desperate people who emerged from the plague's devastation, the community has grown to nearly 300 residents, who enjoy a standard of living that exceeds what most of them could have achieved under pre-plague conditions. The economic innovations, social arrangements, and cultural traditions developed during the recovery period have proven sustainable and adaptable to changing circumstances. But the community's significance extends beyond its own prosperity too. Its demonstration that alternative forms of social organization are possible and potentially superior to traditional arrangements. The democratic decision-making, egalitarian economic relationships, and flexible social structures that emerged from necessity have proven capable of supporting complex community life and continued innovation. These achievements are particularly significant because they occurred despite opposition from external authorities, who viewed social innovation as threatening to established order. The community's ability to maintain its distinctive institutions while participating in broader economic and political systems suggests that social alternatives can coexist with traditional arrangements without requiring complete rejection of existing institutions. However, the passage of time has also revealed limitations and compromises that complicate any simple assessment of the community's innovations. The egalitarian ideals that motivated early recovery efforts have been partially eroded by prosperity-driven social stratification. The democratic decision-making processes have become more formal and less inclusive as the community has grown. The innovative economic arrangements have incorporated traditional elements that reflect external pressures and internal preferences. These changes raise questions about whether the community's innovations represent permanent alternatives to traditional social organization or temporary adaptations to crisis conditions that inevitably evolve toward more conventional arrangements as circumstances normalize. The historical perspective also reveals how much the community's development has been influenced by broader social and economic forces beyond its control. Population recovery, political stability, economic opportunities, and cultural changes throughout the region have all affected the community's choices and constrained its options. From maintaining distinctive institutions, the community's relationship with external authorities illustrates these constraints. Despite preferences for autonomy and innovation, the community has been forced to accommodate external demands for taxation, regulation, and social conformity that limit its ability to maintain radically different institutions. The survival of social innovations may depend as much on external tolerance as on internal commitment. The generational perspective is equally complex. The adults who created the community's institutions were motivated by shared memories of catastrophe and collective participation in recovery efforts. But young people who grew up after the crisis don't have those formative experiences and may not understand or value innovations that seem arbitrary rather than necessary. Some young adults have chosen to leave the community for opportunities in larger towns and cities that offer more diverse experiences and greater individual advancement potential. Others remain, but bring different perspectives that gradually modify community traditions and institutions. The question of whether innovative social arrangements can survive generational change without losing their essential characteristics remains unresolved. Your own personal reflection on the experience reveals similar complexities. The plague and its aftermath transformed you from a desperate survivor into a founding member of an innovative community, providing experiences and opportunities that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The crisis forced development of capabilities and relationships that created a meaningful and prosperous life. But the personal costs were also significant. The trauma of witnessing mass death and social collapse left psychological scars that never completely healed. The constant uncertainty and responsibility during the recovery period created stress and anxiety that affected health and relationships. The satisfaction of contributing to community innovation was balanced by the burden of constant decision-making and conflict resolution. The historical reckoning ultimately suggests that social innovation is both possible and difficult. Possible because human creativity and cooperation can develop solutions to seemingly impossible challenges, but difficult because innovations must survive not only their original circumstances, but also the challenges of success, growth, and changing conditions. The community's experience provides evidence that alternatives to traditional social arrangements are feasible and potentially beneficial. But it also demonstrates that creating and maintaining those alternatives requires sustained effort, favorable circumstances, and willingness to adapt to changing conditions while preserving essential values and institutions. As you enter the 20th year after the plague, the question of what lasting legacy your community's innovations will leave for future generations becomes increasingly important. The children who were born after the plague are now adults with their own families, and their understanding of the community's history and values will determine whether the social experiment continues or gradually dissolves into more conventional arrangements. The challenge of legacy transmission is complicated by the simple fact that the formative experiences that created the community's distinctive institutions cannot be replicated for subsequent generations. The crisis that forced innovation, the necessity that motivated cooperation, and the blank slate that allowed experimentation with new social arrangements are historical circumstances that won't return unless another catastrophe occurs. Young adults who grew up in the prosperous community see its institutions and traditions as inherited customs, rather than creative responses to desperate necessity. They may value these arrangements because they provide benefits, but they don't have the emotional investment that comes from participating in their creation. Under life or death conditions, this generational difference becomes apparent in how young people approach community traditions and decision-making processes. They participate in democratic discussions and consensus-building activities, but often with an attitude of routine compliance rather than passionate commitment. The community meetings that were vital expressions of collective determination during the crisis have become routine administrative procedures that many young people find tedious, rather than inspiring. The difference in attitude affects the quality and effectiveness of democratic participation. The original survivors brought urgency and personal investment to community decisions because they understood that their survival and prosperity depended on making good choices collectively. Young people who have always enjoyed security and prosperity may not understand why collective decision-making is preferable to simpler authoritarian arrangements. This challenge is compounded by external influences that provide alternative models of social organization. Young people who travel to other communities for trade, education, or marriage opportunities observe traditional hierarchical arrangements that may seem more efficient or prestigious than local democratic institutions. Some return with questions about why their community maintains practices that seem unusual or unnecessary compared to normal social arrangements. The community has attempted to address legacy transmission through formal education programs that teach community history and explain the reasoning behind local institutions. Children learn about the plague experience, the recovery process, and the development of community innovations as part of their basic education. But this educational approach has limitations. Historical instruction can transmit factual knowledge about past events, but it cannot recreate the emotional experiences that motivated innovation and cooperation. Young people can learn about the plague and recovery intellectually without developing the personal commitment to community values that animated their parents' choices. The legacy challenge is further complicated by success-related changes in community composition and character. The community now includes many residents who immigrated after the crisis period and who don't share the founding experiences that shaped local institutions. These newcomers may appreciate the benefits of community life, but they don't have the same emotional investment in preserving distinctive institutions that original survivors maintain. Some immigrants actively advocate for changes that would bring community practices closer to traditional arrangements they're familiar with from their previous communities. Their arguments often focus on efficiency, prestige, or compatibility with external expectations rather than on the values and experiences that originally motivated local innovations. The tension between legacy preservation and practical adaptation creates ongoing debates about which community institutions are essential and which can be modified or abandoned without losing the community's distinctive character. Some original survivors argue for maintaining all innovative practices as integral parts of a coherent social system that shouldn't be compromised. Others acknowledge that some changes may be necessary for continued success and growth. The resolution of legacy questions will determine whether the community's innovations provide lasting contributions to social development or represent interesting, but ultimately irrelevant historical curiosities if the next generation can find ways to maintain essential values and institutions while adapting to changing circumstances. The community's experiments may influence broader social development, but if generational change leads to gradual abandonment of innovative practices in favor of more conventional arrangements, the community's experience may be remembered primarily as evidence of human adaptability during crisis rather than as a model for permanent social improvement. The legacy question ultimately depends on whether the community's innovations provide sufficient practical and emotional benefits to motivate continued commitment from people who didn't participate in their creation and who have other options available to them. 25 years after the plague, your community faces a moment of decision that will determine its future direction and historical significance. A combination of internal pressures and external opportunities has created circumstances that require explicit choices about whether to preserve the social innovations developed during the recovery period or to evolve toward more conventional arrangements that might provide greater prosperity and security. The immediate catalyst for this decision is an invitation from the king's representatives to participate in a new administrative system that would provide official recognition, legal protection, and economic privileges in exchange for conformity to standard feudal arrangements. The offer is attractive because it would resolve ongoing tensions with external authorities, while providing access to resources and opportunities currently unavailable to the community. But accepting the offer would require abandoning many of the democratic institutions and egalitarian practices that have defined the community's distinctive character. Traditional feudal organization assumes hierarchical relationships, hereditary authority, and individual property rights that conflict with the collective decision-making and resource-sharing arrangements that enabled the community's success. The debate over this decision reveals how much the community has changed since the plague period, and how different residents have different priorities and values. Some community members, particularly successful entrepreneurs and craftsmen who have accumulated significant wealth, favor accepting the royal offer because it would provide security and prestige that their prosperity deserves. We've proven that our innovations work, argues Master Robert, whose expanded metalworking operation now employs 12 workers and serves customers throughout the region. But we've also proven that we can be successful without rejecting all aspects of traditional organization. Accepting royal recognition would give us the best of both worlds, protection for our achievements, and opportunities for continued growth. But other residents, particularly original plague survivors and people who have benefited most from the community's egalitarian arrangements, see the royal offer as a threat to everything that makes the community worth preserving. What's the point of prosperity if it comes at the cost of the values and relationships that created it? Asked Margaret, now the community's unofficial historian and conscience. We didn't survive the plague just to recreate the same inequalities and limitations that made pre-plague life so difficult for ordinary people. The debate extends beyond immediate practical considerations to fundamental questions about the purpose and meaning of community life. Is the goal to achieve maximum material prosperity and security, even if that requires abandoning distinctive institutions and values? Or is the goal to preserve alternative forms of social organization that may be less efficient, but more humane than traditional arrangements? The discussion also reveals generational differences that have been developing for years. Many young adults favor accepting the royal offer because they see it as an opportunity for individual advancement and integration with broader society. They view the community's distinctive institutions as obstacles to personal opportunity, rather than as valuable innovations worth preserving. Older residents, particularly those who remember the plague period, see the royal offer as a betrayal of the principles and sacrifices that enabled survival and recovery. They worry that accepting traditional arrangements will gradually erode the social bonds and cooperative institutions that have sustained community prosperity. The decision is further complicated by external pressures that make neutrality increasingly difficult. The king's representatives have made clear that refusing their offer may result in hostile treatment that could threaten the community's security and prosperity. Other communities in the region have already accepted similar arrangements, creating competitive pressures that affect trade relationships and political standing. But accepting the offer would also set precedents that could lead to further compromises of community autonomy and distinctiveness. Once traditional authority is accepted in some areas, it may be difficult to maintain innovative practices in others. The logic of feudal organization tends toward comprehensive hierarchical relationships that leave little space for democratic alternatives. The community has spent months debating the decision through the democratic processes that would themselves be threatened by accepting the royal offer. The discussions have been thorough and inclusive, but they have also revealed deep divisions about values and priorities that may not be resolvable through consensus building. Some residents have already begun making individual preparations for either outcome. Successful craftsmen have established relationships with traditional authorities that would allow them to prosper under feudal arrangements, while committed innovators have identified other communities where democratic experiments might continue if local arrangements are abandoned. The decision process itself has become a test of whether democratic institutions can handle fundamental questions about their own survival can collective decision-making produce choices that preserve the conditions necessary for continued collective decision-making? Or do some decisions require individual choices that may fracture community consensus? The moment of decision ultimately requires the community to choose not just between specific arrangements, but between different visions of human potential and social possibility. The choice will determine whether the community's innovations represent a permanent contribution to social development or a temporary experiment that couldn't survive the test of time and changing circumstances. After months of debate, discussion, and soul-searching, the community reaches its decision through a process that exemplifies both the strengths and limitations of the democratic institutions that have guided its development. For 25 years, the choice, when it finally emerges, reflects the complex realities of attempting to preserve social innovations while adapting to changing circumstances and competing pressures. The community decides to accept the royal offer, but with conditions that attempt to preserve essential elements of their distinctive institutions, while gaining the benefits of official recognition and protection. The negotiated arrangement allows the community to maintain internal democratic decision-making while accepting external feudal obligations, to preserve collective resource management while recognizing individual property rights, and to continue innovative economic practices while conforming to standard legal and administrative requirements. This compromise solution satisfies neither those who wanted complete acceptance of traditional arrangements, nor those who preferred complete rejection of external authority, but it reflects the practical wisdom of people who have learned through hard experience that survival and prosperity often require accepting imperfect solutions to complex problems. The decision process itself reveals how the community has evolved since the plague period. The original survivors who made life or death decisions quickly and decisively have been replaced by a more deliberative process that considers multiple perspectives and seeks consensus among diverse interests. The urgency that once drove innovation has been replaced by careful consideration that prioritizes stability and gradual improvement over dramatic change. Margaret, now in her 70s and one of the few remaining original survivors, accepts the decision with mixed feelings that reflect her own evolution from desperate survivor to community elder. We've learned that perfect solutions are rarely available. She tells the community meeting that finalizes the arrangement. The question isn't whether this decision preserves everything we value, but whether it preserves enough of what matters most while protecting us from dangers we can't control. The implementation of the negotiated arrangement proves more complex than anyone anticipated. Traditional feudal authorities have their own expectations and requirements that don't always accommodate the community's distinctive practices. Royal officials expect hierarchical relationships and individual property rights that conflict with democratic decision-making and collective resource management. But the community has also developed skills in adaptation and negotiation that help them navigate these challenges. They learn to present their practices in ways that satisfy external requirements while preserving essential functions. Democratic decisions are implemented through appointed officials who can interact with traditional authorities. Collective resources are legally organized as individual holdings that are managed cooperatively. The result is a complex hybrid system that combines traditional forms with innovative content. The community maintains many of its distinctive institutions and values, but presents them in ways that conform to external expectations and legal requirements. The arrangement is awkward and sometimes inefficient, but it allows the community to survive and prosper while preserving much of what made it unique. The compromise also creates opportunities for influence that might not have been available under complete autonomy. By participating in broader administrative and economic systems, the community can demonstrate the effectiveness of its innovations to other communities and authorities who might be interested in adopting similar practices. Some of the community's techniques for democratic decision-making, resource management, and economic cooperation begin to spread to other communities through trade relationships, intermarriage, and migration. The community's example provides evidence that alternative social arrangements are possible and potentially beneficial even under traditional political and legal frameworks. But the compromise also involves genuine losses that affect the community's character and future development. The need to conform to external expectations limits experimentation and innovation that might have led to further improvements in social organization. The acceptance of hierarchical relationships creates internal tensions that gradually erode egalitarian values and democratic participation. Most significantly, the compromise affects how the community understands itself and its historical significance. Rather than seeing itself as a radical alternative to traditional social organization, the community begins to view its innovations as practical adaptations that can coexist with conventional arrangements. The revolutionary potential of the plague period gives way to reformist accommodation that works within existing systems rather than challenging them fundamentally. The long-term implications of this choice will only become apparent over subsequent generations, but the immediate effect is to stabilize the community's position while reducing its distinctiveness. The social experiment that began with desperate survivors creating new institutions from necessity evolves into a successful community that has found ways to preserve some innovative practices while accepting most traditional arrangements. Whether this evolution represents success or failure depends on the criteria used for evaluation. By measures of survival, prosperity, and stability, the community has clearly succeeded. By measures of social innovation, democratic development, and transformative change, the results are more ambiguous as you approach the end of your own life. 30 years after the plague that transformed your world, you find yourself reflecting on the long journey from catastrophe to accommodation, and on what the experience reveals about human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and social change. The community that surrounds you bears little resemblance to the desperate band of survivors who emerged from the plague's devastation, but it also differs significantly from the traditional medieval society that existed before the catastrophe. The physical transformation is the most obvious. Where once stood a village of perhaps 60 modest cottages, housing 300 people in conditions of relative poverty and limited opportunity, there now stands a prosperous town of nearly 400 residents living in comfortable houses, with access to amenities and opportunities that would have been unimaginable before the plague. The economic transformation is equally dramatic. The subsistence agriculture and limited craft production that barely sustained pre-plague life has been replaced by diversified economic activity that generates surplus wealth and supports trade relationships throughout the region. The innovations developed during the recovery period, more efficient agricultural techniques, flexible craft organization, and cooperative resource management, have proven sustainable and profitable, but the social transformation is more complex and ambiguous. The democratic institutions and egalitarian relationships that emerged from the plague experience have survived in modified form, but they coexist with traditional hierarchical arrangements that have gradually reasserted influence. As the community has grown and prospered, the result is a hybrid social system that combines innovative and traditional elements in ways that would have been impossible under either pure democracy or pure feudalism. Community decisions are still made through collective discussion, but they're implemented through appointed officials who answer to external authorities. Resources are still shared cooperatively, but within a legal framework that recognizes individual property rights. This hybrid arrangement has proven remarkably successful at combining the benefits of innovation with the security of traditional arrangements. The community enjoys both the prosperity that comes from efficient cooperation and the protection that comes from conformity to established legal and political systems. But the compromises also involve losses that affect the community's character and potential. The radical egalitarianism of the early recovery period has given way to moderate reforms that improve conditions without fundamentally challenging traditional power relationships. The experimental democracy has evolved into limited participation within conventional administrative structures. Most significantly, the sense of unlimited possibility that characterized the plague period has been replaced by acceptance of constraints that may limit future development. The original survivors believed they could create entirely new forms of social organization because they had no choice but to innovate or die. Their successors work within existing systems to achieve gradual improvements because they have security and prosperity to protect. Your personal reflection on the experience reveals similar patterns of transformation and accommodation. The desperate young person who answered that job advertisement would not recognize the respected community elder you have become, just as that elder sometimes struggles to understand the radical choices that desperation once made seem obvious and necessary. The plague experience taught you that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation and innovation when circumstances require it, but also that innovation is more likely to occur during crisis than during periods of stability and success. The social arrangements that seemed revolutionary when they were created from necessity may seem merely practical when they're maintained through choice. The experience also revealed the complex relationship between individual agency and social circumstances. Your community's innovations were possible because the plague created conditions, population loss, institutional collapse, resource abundance that don't normally exist. The same people with the same values and capabilities might not have been able to create similar innovations under different circumstances. This recognition raises important questions about the broader applicability of the community's experience. Are the lessons learned during the plague period relevant only to crisis conditions, Or do they provide insights that could improve social organization under normal circumstances? Can innovation be deliberately fostered? Or does it require the desperate necessity that crisis provides? Your reflection also reveals the importance of timing and sequence in social development. The innovations that worked well during the immediate post-plague period might not have been successful at other times, and some practices that were abandoned, as circumstances changed, might have proven valuable if they had been maintained longer. The community's evolution suggests that social innovation is often temporary and conditional rather than permanent and universal. Practices that seem obviously beneficial under some circumstances may become obstacles under others. And the challenge is knowing when to preserve innovations and when to abandon them in favor of more conventional arrangements. The legacy question that has concerned you in recent years ultimately depends on whether the community's experience provides lasting insights about human potential and social possibility, or whether it represents an interesting historical curiosity that has little relevance for normal circumstances. The answer may depend less on what the community accomplished than on what it demonstrated about the relationship between individual creativity and social constraint. Even if the specific innovations don't survive unchanged, the experience of creating them may have lasting value as evidence that alternative social arrangements are possible when people are willing to experiment and cooperate. Perhaps the most important lesson is that social transformation is both possible and difficult. Possible because human creativity and cooperation can develop solutions to seemingly impossible challenges, but difficult because innovations must survive not only their original circumstances, but also the challenges of success, growth, and changing conditions. The plague survivors who created your community's innovations didn't set out to conduct a social experiment or demonstrate principles of democratic organization. They simply tried to solve immediate problems of survival and prosperity using whatever resources and relationships were available to them. But their practical problem-solving created institutions and practices that have influenced hundreds of lives over 3 decades, and that may continue to influence social development for generations to come. The demonstration that ordinary people can create extraordinary innovations when necessity requires it may be the most lasting legacy of the post-plague experience. As you prepare to join the countless others who didn't survive to see how the story ended, you take satisfaction in knowing that the community will continue to evolve and adapt long after you're gone. The specific arrangements may change, but the capacity for innovation and cooperation that created them will remain available to future generations who face their own challenges and opportunities. The plague that once seemed like the end of the world ultimately became the beginning of a new one. Not perfect, not permanent, but nonetheless remarkable evidence of human resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of impossible circumstances. The screaming that once defined your world has been replaced by the ordinary sounds of prosperous community life, children playing, craftsmen working, neighbors talking. But the silence that followed the screaming taught lessons about survival, cooperation, and transformation that continue to echo in every aspect of the life you helped create from the ashes of catastrophe. This is how history changes, not through grand designs or heroic gestures, but through ordinary people making extraordinary efforts to solve immediate problems and build better lives for themselves and their children. The changes may not last forever, but they create possibilities that didn't exist before and demonstrate potentials that might otherwise remain unknown. The world that emerged from the plague is neither the world that existed before, nor the world that might have been, but it is a world shaped by human choice and effort rather than simply by tradition and circumstance. That transformation, however, modest and temporary, represents a victory worth celebrating and a legacy worth preserving.